All right, welcome back. This week we're going to move on to the digestive system. So, as you can see there, the main functions of the digestive food, in a nutshell, basically what we're going to do is we're going to consume food, we're going to consume macronutrients, which are things like carbohydrates, fat, and protein. And what we're going to do is we're going to, through a series of enzymatic reactions, we're going to break those molecules down. And as we do that, we'll give off energy at various parts of the process. And so that's going to allow us to make ATP. So effectively what we're going to do then is to break those big molecules down into smaller molecules, and we're going to use the energy given off during that process to help us make ATP. So the digestive tract, what it does then is helps us incorporate those macronutrients into the body. One of the ways that the digestive tract is sometimes described is as being sort of separate or outside of the body, because food essentially passes through a long hollow tube. Some of it we absorb into the bloodstream, some of it we don't. So for example, things like cellulose, which are the structural carbohydrates that make up plant stems and leaves and those kinds of things, that's just going to pass right through. So effectively that never really entered the body per se, in that it never moved outside of the lumen of the digestive tract into the bloodstream or into that extracellular tissue, any of that kind of stuff. So what we do then, you can see we take in the food obviously through the mouth. We're going to then break it down into nutrient molecules. So what you're going to do, there's a couple different processes here, and we'll talk about both, but there's essentially mechanical breakdown of the food and then chemical breakdown of the food. So both of those start in the mouth. Mechanical breakdown of the food is, as you'd expect, it's crushing it. So like the teeth, the tongue are going to compress the food, they're going to mash it and all of that. And then once we move it from the mouth into the esophagus, into the stomach, and eventually into the small intestine, we're going to absorb those molecules into the bloodstream. So we'll move things like carbohydrates from the lumen of the intestine into the bloodstream, or same thing with protein, same thing with fat. And then the last thing there is anything that we have to get rid of, we'll do that. So we'll rid the body of any indigestible remains. So you can see there in terms of the organs, there's the way this book breaks them out is in terms of the canal itself, so the GI tract itself. So the organs of the GI tract include the mouth, the pharynx, which is at the back of the mouth. We talked about that some with the respiratory chapter. So you got the mouth, the pharynx, and then the esophagus. The esophagus leads from the pharynx down to the stomach, and then obviously you have the stomach, and then you've got the small intestine, the large intestine, and then the rectum. Right? So the GI tract then is that tube. And then the accessory digestive organs are those that play a role in either the mechanical or the chemical breakdown of food. So for example, the teeth would be included as an accessory digestive organ, as would the tongue. So both of those, again, are going to be involved in the mechanical breakdown of food, as opposed to things like the liver, which is going to make bile, or the pancreas, which secretes pancreatic juice. Both of those play a role in digestion. They actually chemically break down the things that we eat. So those are your accessory digestive organs. So things that are not necessarily directly parts of the canal itself. So again, the teeth are in the mouth. They're part of the canal in a way, but they're not the tube per se. So they're not the GI tract itself. And then there's the schematic. All right. So in terms of processing food, so that's the series of steps there. So you can see ingestion means to take it into the mouth. So getting it, it's eating is another way of thinking about that. Propulsion, so if we're propelling the food, we're moving it through the GI tract. And there's a term on there which is peristalsis. So you have, through most of the GI tract, you have two layers of smooth muscle that surround that tract. So there is a longitudinal layer. And the longitudinal layer, the smooth muscle fibers run up and down, as you would think. So they run in parallel with the tube. And then you have a circumferential layer. And so that layer is going to be involved in what you see there on the right, the segmentation, which is, that happens primarily in the small intestine. It's where we kind of move food back and forth and expose it to the various digestive enzymes. So we use, again, that circular layer of smooth muscle tissue to do that. So peristalsis then, what you have is this sequential contraction of the smooth muscle from superior to inferior, so from top to bottom, and we kind of wring the food down the esophagus and into the stomach, and then we use peristalsis as well in the stomach to project it into the small intestine and then through the rest of the tract. So peristalsis then is contraction of the longitudinal layers of smooth muscle to propel that food through the GI tract. And then the next thing on there is mechanical breakdown of the food. So mechanical breakdown actually preceded peristalsis, but that's okay. So the mechanical breakdown, as I mentioned on the last slide, is things you're physically compressing the food, you're crushing it, you're exposing it to all those digestive enzymes. So mechanical breakdown then includes things like chewing, so obviously that starts in the mouth, churning in the stomach. So the stomach actually has a third layer of smooth muscle that we'll talk about, an oblique layer that allows the stomach to also play a role in the mechanical breakdown of the food. It sort of compresses on itself and crushes the food up some as well. And then segmentation, again, that picture in the lower right, B, is segmentation. And so again, what that's showing you is in the small intestine, you get these alternating sets of contraction and relaxation that are going to compress the food there. And for what it's worth, it's something called chyme that'll show up on a future slide, and chyme is spelled C-H-Y-M-E. And so that is once what you've eaten, once the food moves into the stomach, it becomes chyme. And so what you're seeing there in the segmentation is that alternating contraction, relaxation to expose the chyme to those digestive juices in the small intestine. And then those enzymes, those digestive juices, help break the bonds in protein or help break the bonds in fat to allow it to become or to generate smaller molecules that we can absorb. So for example, with sugars, so sugars are, the way that we ingest them oftentimes is as polysaccharides, which are like long strings of individual glucose molecules. And we can't absorb a molecule that's that big. So what we have to do to actually get it from the lumen of the intestine into our bloodstream is break off those long strings of sugars. We have to break the bonds between them into single glucose molecules, for example. And once we've broken it down into a monosaccharide, which is a single sugar, then we can move that glucose into the epithelium of the small intestine and then across that cell and into the bloodstream. So that digestion here, they're using it to refer to the chemical process. And so what we're doing then is we're using enzymes to break the bonds in those big molecules. So again, things like polysaccharides to help us so that we can absorb those things, right? And so then you get absorption. And then whatever it is that is left, anything that we can't or don't want to move into the bloodstream, then that becomes waste. And so then we defecate that, we excrete whatever's left. And then there's the picture of the process there. So as they say in every nutrition class ever, digestion starts in the mouth. And it does, both from a chemical and mechanical standpoint. And this book even uses that same terminology. So one of the things with the mouth is the importance of the saliva. This book talks about that at length. And the saliva does do a lot. Again, it starts the digestion process. So saliva has two enzymes in it. So amylase, anything that's an ACE is an enzyme, and amylases are enzymes that break down carbohydrates. So the breakdown of carbohydrates, again, breaking down those long strings of carbohydrates into single glucose molecules, that's going to start in the mouth. And then you also have a lingual, so anything lingual is the tongue, lingual lipase. So a lipase then is something that breaks down fat. And so lingual lipase is an enzyme produced by the tongue that is going to break down large fat molecules into their constituent parts. Then other things that saliva does, so it's going to moisten the food that you take in. So think about if you ate something kind of dry like crackers or bread or something like that. And what it's going to do is, as you moisten that helps form a small sort of ball of food, as unappealing as that is. But that little ball of food, that compressed food, then becomes what's referred to as a bolus. And so you can see the spelling of that there. So what you actually compress it into and swallow is referred to as a bolus. And so then that bolus moves down the throat into the esophagus. And then again, once it hits the stomach, then it changes from a bolus into chyme. just so you see where I'm going with the terminology there. Um, so in addition to having those digestive enzymes and helping moisten the food, saliva does have some protective effects on the mouth. So it helps keep everything moist, obviously. And so in doing that, it's going to play a role in protection of the teeth. Um, it also, one of the interesting parts is that in terms of what saliva does, is that lost my train of thought there. Well, I'm back now. Okay, so one of the things that it does is the secretion of saliva is regulated by the autonomic nervous system. So remember the autonomic, that's the automatic nervous system. There's the sympathetic branch, which is fight or flight, the parasympathetic branch, which is rest and digest. And so with the parasympathetic branch, obviously when you're parasympathetic dominant, that's when you're going to get increased secretion of saliva, because again, that's rest and digest. And then if you become sympathetic dominant, so if you switch to fight or flight, which we do when we're scared, when we're exercising, all of those kinds of things, then the mouth, you're going to slow down secretion of saliva, which is why if you have to do something that is stressful for you, like public speaking for a lot of people, and you notice that your mouth is kind of dry, that's why, is because of that sympathetic dominance that you've got at that point. So once you swallow the food, then it's going to move from the mouth into the oropharynx, which again is the back part of the mouth, and then it's going to move into the laryngopharynx, and I'm going to bring up my pointer here. So this guy's got his bolus, and he swallows, and then we move over here, and so the bolus now is in the moving into the laryngopharynx here. And so why I mention that is because you can see the epiglottis, and the spelling is there for you. So the epiglottis is going to separate the trachea, well, the larynx up here and then the trachea, from the esophagus. So it keeps us from what's referred to as aspirating our food. So because obviously if you start getting food and sugar, like if you're drinking Coke and you aspirate that, if you get that down to your lungs, that's not great, because those can then promote bacterial growth. They may have bacteria in them, and so then that can lead to things like pneumonia. So we have to keep food out of our respiratory tract, and so we do that here in the laryngopharynx by closing the epiglottis. And so when that's closed, then the bolus moves from the laryngopharynx on down into the esophagus, and you can see it here, and then it continues through peristalsis. So again, we're going to get that contraction. So contraction up here, relaxation here, contraction, relaxation, and that's going to force the food all the way down the esophagus and into the stomach. So there is, down here you see the gastroesophageal sphincter. That's what GE stands for. So the gastroesophageal sphincter is down here. It separates the esophagus from the stomach, and it actually, as you would expect, serves a really important function, and that function is to maintain separate environments between those two components of the digestive tract, because the stomach is a pretty hostile environment. So the stomach, as you know, is very, very acidic, and in a way, it plays a role in the immune system. So remember, thinking back to the respiratory chapter, one of the things that we talked about was that you've got macrophages inside of the lungs that'll attack bacteria, viruses, dust, the stuff that you breathe in that makes it down to the lungs. The macrophages will attack that stuff. Eventually the macrophages die, and so then we have to propel them via ciliated epithelium up into the throat, so up the larynx, and then we actually push it back into the esophagus. So all those dead macrophages then make their way down into the digestive tract, and then we use the acid to kill anything that may have survived. So if you've got bacteria or viruses or dust or whatever, they got trapped in that mucus that's in the sinuses, for example, we use that mucus to trap it, and then we push that down to the stomach, and so the acidic environment of the stomach kills that, almost all of it, right? So the stomach then serves an important immune function. But as it relates to the current discussion, so in order to kill all of those things that make it into the respiratory tract or into the mouth, the stomach has to, again, be a pretty harsh, pretty acidic environment. The pH is somewhere between 1 and 3, so pretty low, very acidic. And so the stomach has a way that it protects itself. It has a mucus coat that we'll talk about, but the esophagus does not. And so if some of that acid makes it from the stomach into the esophagus, then that's going to damage the epithelium, again, that lining of the esophagus. And so if that happens repeatedly, that can then cause perforations there. So it can actually it can burn its way through. It's associated with esophageal cancer, all of those kind of things. So that's bad. We don't want that. And so we have the gastroesophageal sphincter here to keep those two separate. But of course, it doesn't work 100% all of the time. And so one of the things that happens in heartburn is that you get some reflux of the acid up into the esophagus. And so again, that's going to cause that painful sensation that people associate with heartburn. So you can get that. Sometimes people get it from overeating, but it's also associated with things like extreme obesity, pregnancy. Runners tend to be more likely to have heartburn and gastroesophageal reflux disease. So, and usually, or a lot of the time, if you can figure out what the trigger for it is, then that'll help alleviate the problem. But there are other ways, different medications to decrease the acidity of the stomach acutely, like Tums, or more chronically, different proton pump inhibitors, those kinds of things. But so the sphincter there serves that important role of separating those two components of the tract. All right, move on. There we go. All right, so then the stomach. So you can see the functions of the stomach there and the picture of the stomach there. So what you've got in terms of that depiction, remember that I mentioned that the stomach has an extra layer of muscle. So it not only has a longitudinal layer and the circular layer that we talked about, but it also has an oblique layer. And so that additional layer of muscle makes the stomach really good at kind of compressing in on itself. But also, what we're going to do is we're going to get these waves of peristalsis, which are going to start kind of over here, and they're going to then push the food into the small intestine over here. So this sphincter here, the pyloric sphincter, is going to separate the stomach from the small intestine, which is this part here. So where it says duodenum, that's the first part of the small intestine. So that oblique layer of the stomach then is going to help with the mechanical breakdown of the food. And then, again, is going to help propel that food out of the stomach and into the small intestine. So things that the stomach does, so you can see it's involved in the breakdown of food. So again, that mechanical breakdown, but also the chemical breakdown. So for example, the stomach secretes hydrochloric acid, as we talked about, which helps break down proteins. Because remember, we talked about the mouth, that you've got the lingual lipase, which is an enzyme that breaks down fat, and then we had the amylase, salivary amylase, which breaks down carbohydrates, but we haven't started protein digestion yet. So protein digestion doesn't start until we reach the stomach, at least. And so again, here I'm using digestion in the terms of chemical breakdown of the food. So that doesn't happen until we hit the stomach. So the hydrochloric acid in the stomach plays an important role in that, as does pepsin, which helps break down proteins as well. So the breakdown of proteins then starts in the stomach. Also serves as a holding area. So we can only absorb so much food at any one time. And so what the stomach does is it pushes small amounts of chyme, because again, so remember what you've chewed up and mashed up and what's made it down into the stomach is sort of a paste, and so then that's called chyme. So because we can only absorb a little bit at a time, we have to regulate the entry of that chyme into the small intestine. And so we do essentially 3 milliliters of chyme gets ejected every few minutes from the stomach into the small intestine. So helps us regulate our blood sugar a little bit better, because if all of that, all the food that we ate moved right into the intestine, moved right in for absorption, you'd get this big spike in blood sugar, and that would be a real problem. We'd have to secrete lots of insulin, have to be able to take it out pretty quick. And so by the stomach serving as sort of that holding area and releasing a little bit of chyme every few minutes, then that enables us to keep homeostasis a little bit more easily. We don't have to have these as big of spikes in blood glucose, for example. Which would necessitate a big spike in insulin. That's where I was going. All right, enzymatic digestion of proteins, talked about that. And then intrinsic factor. So intrinsic factor is secreted by the stomach, and the reason that it's important is it is necessary for the absorption of B12 in the small intestine. So the stomach makes intrinsic factor, and once intrinsic factor moves into the small intestine, it aids in the absorption of B12. And remember, we talked about this with the blood chapter, that B12 is necessary in order for red blood cells to mature. So if you don't have enough B12, if you're not able to absorb it, then you can't make enough red blood cells. And so then you're going to have a type of anemia that we talked about in that chapter, which is pernicious anemia. So if you have damage to the lining of the stomach, you may not make enough intrinsic factor, and so then you may end up with that type of anemia related to that. So that typically then necessitates B12 injections because you're not able to absorb it, and so then you can kind of get around that by injecting it. All right, so the rugae. So one of the things that you'll notice about the stomach there, if you look at the cutaway at the inner wall of the stomach, it kind of looks like a raisin a little bit. And so those folds that give it that appearance, or it looks like a brain, however you want to go with that, but those folds are called the rugae. And so they allow the stomach to stretch. That's an important thing that the stomach is able to do. So when the stomach is empty, it gets pretty small. It holds less than 50 milliliters of fluid, but fully expanded, depending upon your size, may be as high as 4 liters of fluid. So if you think about a liter, you should have looked up the conversions, but it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 32 ounces of fluid, something like that. So if you can hold 4 of those, so the stomach can hold quite a bit. And so what enables it to do that are those folds, those rugae, that enable it to stretch out when we consume a lot of food and water. And then if there's nothing in there, then they allow it to shrink back down so it doesn't take as much space, because we don't need it taking up a bunch of space all the time. So there are stretch receptors around the stomach, and they play a role in satiety. Satiety is a feeling of fullness. And so one of the things that happens is when the stomach gets distended, when it gets stretched out, that's one of the things that produces a feeling of satiety or a feeling of fullness. And so as you consume food and as the stomach fills up, then you get this signaling mechanism that, hey, the stretch receptors of the stomach are extended, and so because of that, there must be a lot in the stomach, and so maybe slow down eating. You're gonna start to feel full. So and you see at times certain diets and gimmicks that are kind of based on that. So when I was in the late 90s working at Gold's Gym as a personal trainer, one of the gimmicks that we had going for a while is that we had paired up with apple producers in Washington State. And the Gold's Gym is a chain, not just the ones in Texas. And so the gist of the diet was that you were supposed to eat an apple before every meal. And so one of the things that would do is that pre-eating would serve to stretch out the stomach a little bit, not much, but a little bit. And so then that apple, because it has a lot of water in it, that would take up some space, and so that would make you feel full sooner, and so you wouldn't consume as much. Doesn't seem like the most successful diet plan, but it probably moved a lot of apples, so they had that going for them. A related gimmick that's probably a little more effective is people are sometimes advised to drink a glass or 2 of water before they eat. So if you drink 16 ounces of water before you start eating, obviously that's going to pre-stretch the stomach out, and so because of that, you're going to feel full sooner, and you won't have consumed as many calories, hopefully, and so and that might help you lose weight or certainly not gain as much. So both of those things then capitalize on those stretch receptors. In terms of satiety, so again, in terms of fullness, so you see 2 hormones on there, cholecystokinin. The abbreviation for that one is CCK, and we've talked about it before, but cholecystokinin is released by the cells of the duodenum. So again, this first part of the small intestine after we eat. And so things that it does, so again, it's a hormone, so it's going to be released in the blood, so it's going to circulate throughout the entire body, and it only affects tissues that have the receptors for it. But it causes the release of digestive enzymes from the pancreas and from the gallbladder, both of which are involved in fat breakdown. We'll talk about pancreatic juice in a minute. It does other stuff. But the gallbladder is involved in secreting bile, which helps us break down fat. In addition to that, cholecystokinin, it's particularly released if you have consume a meal that's high in fat. And so, because you're going to need then both bile and pancreatic juice in order to break that high fat meal down. But the other thing is that there's receptors for CCK in the hypothalamus, and so that's going to then produce that feeling of fullness. And then another hormone, leptin, is actually produced by fat cells. And so when the fat cells are full, or when their energy stores are sufficient, is another way of thinking of it, they are then going to release leptin, which then has the effect of a hunger suppressor. It produces a feeling of satiety. All right. Other stuff. So there's the spelling of chyme for you. So CHYME. So again, whatever you, when you chew food and swallow it, that's a bolus. Once it hits the stomach, it becomes chyme. And so the rest of the way through, we're going to refer to that mixture of things that you've eaten as chyme. Gastric emptying, we're going to talk about more on a later slide, but gastric emptying is the rate at which things leave the stomach. And so gastric emptying, that rate is dependent upon a number of things. It's dependent upon how much volume is in the stomach. It's dependent upon how concentrated that is, and also what the nutrient makeup is. So if you have a meal that is high in fat and protein, that slows down gastric emptying. It stays in the stomach a little bit longer because it takes longer for you to enzymatically break those things down in the small intestine and absorb them. So meals that are high in fat, high in protein, tend to produce a feeling of fullness for longer because it slows down gastric emptying. If you have really concentrated chyme, so if you eat a bunch of food and don't drink very much water, so that's going to be a really concentrated kind of a paste, that also slows down gastric emptying. So one of the ways to speed transit up, speed things through the digestive tract, is to consume a lot of fluid with it. And so what that does then is it produces a less concentrated chyme, which then moves it more quickly from the stomach into the small intestine, where we can start to absorb it. All right, so if you look more closely at the stomach, so I mentioned that, again, the stomach is a pretty hostile environment, and so we have to keep it from digesting itself. We have to be able to protect the stomach from the things that it secretes. And so there's a few different ways that we do that. The first you can see there is the 2-layer mucus coat. And so there is a superficial layer, if you will, to that mucus coat that is a really basic mucus. So it's alkaline, it's really basic. So it counteracts that acidity. And then underneath that is a bicarbonate-rich fluid. And so essentially what you'd have is just atop these cells, you'd have that bicarbonate-rich fluid and then that alkaline mucus on top of it, and they kind of seal off this stuff. So these cells, as we're going to show you in a second, these are going to generate that hydrochloric acid, the pepsin, and so those are going to break down the food that we've eaten. Those are going to break down the chyme, but we're going to have to migrate them past that mucus bilayer. So you've got that 2-layer mucus coat that helps protect the stomach itself, so the epithelium of the stomach, or the mucosa. And then between the cells, this surface epithelium, you're going to have tight junctions. And so remember, those tight junctions are going to hold those cells together, and the purpose of tight junctions is to prevent things slipping between cells. And so we don't want any of that hydrochloric acid. We don't want those the enzymes that break down protein making it out of the stomach. And so the tight junctions between these cells keep those enzymes, for example, from slipping between this epithelium and into this underlying tissue. And then where it says rapid div, that's rapid division. So these cells turn over pretty quick because despite the protection of the mucus coat, those cells tend to get damaged. I mean, there's a lot of mechanically going on in the stomach with the consistent peristalsis, where it's contracting on its own pretty consistently. So that then leads to some mechanical damage of those cells lining the stomach, and so those cells then get turned over somewhere between once and twice a week. So each cell only makes it about half a week. And then the other one on there is the gastric pits. So these things are the gastric pits. And so I'm going to show you a close-up of that here in a second. So this next picture is a close-up of that. There you go. And so in the gastric pits, there's 4 different kinds of cells. So there's the mucous neck cells, and so they play a role in secreting that mucus that we talked about, so that 2-layer mucus coat. Some of that comes from the mucous neck cells. From a digestive standpoint, the parietal cells are going to be pretty important. So you can see the parietal cells are the blue ones here. And so the parietal cells, as you can see, secrete hydrochloric acid. That's what the HCl is. And they also generate intrinsic factor. Remember, that's what we need in the small intestine in order to be able to absorb B12. So The hydrochloric acid, again, is going to play an important role in killing any sort of invading pathogens, but also the hydrochloric acid is going to activate pepsin to pepsinogen. So that's going to play a role in the breakdown of protein. So hydrochloric acid helps denature proteins, but it also helps break down. So if you eat a big salad or something, while we can't break apart the cellulose that makes up the structural carbohydrates of that plant, we can break them down to. We can't break it down enough to actually absorb those carbohydrates, but we can break them down to make it easier for them to pass through the rest of the GI tract. And so hydrochloric acid plays an important role in that breakdown. Let's see what else. Okay, chief cells. So chief cells, you can see there, they secrete pepsinogen, which is then activated to pepsin by hydrochloric acid, and then they also secrete some lipases, which account for about 15% of the digestion of fats. Again, we haven't absorbed it yet, but we're going to start to break down the fats into smaller constituent molecules. And then the enteroendocrine cells, so those are, they secrete hormones. Most of them are paracrines, which mean that they act locally. So they'll act on neighboring cells, but some of them are released systematically, but you don't have to worry about those. So the big players here are the parietal cells, which release hydrochloric acid, the chief cells, which release pepsinogen. All right, and I have a case study for you that we would have done in class, but I'll read it to you anyway. And so the case is that you are a high school coach and one of your colleagues comes to you complaining of stomach pain. He tells you he's had the pain for months now, and that in addition to burning pain, it often feels like he is bloated and he burps pretty frequently. The pain gets worse when he drinks alcohol or when he doesn't eat for a long time, and fatty foods tend to give him really severe heartburn, and he's generally nauseous. So what could this coach have going on given that constellation of symptoms? Typically people guess this one pretty quick, and the answer is a peptic ulcer or gastric ulcer. And so what you've got there with an ulcer is there's been some sort of a disruption in that mucus coat of the stomach, and so that has allowed that hydrochloric acid to get through that mucus layer and to cause a perforation or cause a hole in the lining of the stomach. The question becomes, what caused that disruption? So usually when I ask that in class, how is it that we had this significant breach of that mucus bilayer, and that allowed for that the hole to develop in the mucosa of the stomach. And so usually people will say something like, stress or spicy foods or those kinds of things, and those are good guesses and widely held beliefs, but the reality is that most ulcers are caused by a bacteria called H. pylori. And the reason I mention that is because the discovery of that bacteria and the fact that that was what caused most gastric ulcers is a pretty interesting story. So it was discovered by an Australian internist in the early 1980s. His name was Barry Marshall. And at that time, as I mentioned, it was thought that ulcers were caused by stress and or spicy foods. So in patients with severe gastric ulcers, the patients would have persistent bleeds, because as you can imagine, if you get that perforation of the stomach, you're going to have some bleeding with that, and recurrent infections. So that then can lead to peritonitis, can lead to a life-threatening infection, right? And so that's really problematic if you have these persistent bleeds from the stomach, or certainly it can be. So some of those patients that had those recurrent bleeds and recurrent infections had to have their stomachs removed, or they died from those bleeds or infections. And so what Barry Marshall did was he was working with a pathologist at his hospital and discovered that while doing autopsies, on patients who had ulcers, who may or may not have died related to that ulcer, he discovered that there was a particular bacterium, that H. pylori, that was present in almost all of them. And so not only was that bacteria present in almost all of the patients who had gastric ulcers, but it was also present in many of the patients who had stomach cancer. So what Marshall did then was he cultured that bacteria and he gave it to mice, healthy mice, and so shortly thereafter those mice developed ulcers, as you'd expect. So that's pretty neat. So then one would think that would be sufficient to show, or at least be pretty close to showing, that that bacteria played a really important role in development of those ulcers. However, when Marshall told other physicians, they were largely skeptical of his findings, and so they remained unconvinced that ulcers were caused by that bacteria. And so what Marshall had to do then was show that it caused an ulcer in people. But of course, that would be really unethical to do, to give people this bacteria and wait for them to develop ulcers. And so he did what many physicians had done certainly since at least the 1800s, which is he used himself as the test subject. And so what he did was he cultured some bacteria from the guts of one of his patients. And so he took that H. pylori from a living patient, made a bunch of it, and then he drank that mixture. And so in the days following that, he developed gastritis, which is the precursor to an ulcer, and then he biopsied his own stomach to show that the bacteria were the cause, and then he took antibiotics, which kill that bacteria. And so after having done that, the symptoms subsided. And so now, if patients have an ulcer, typically they're prescribed antibiotics along with medications that block acid production, so things like Prilosec or Nexium, and antacids to promote the healing. So it's not really well understood how the bacteria is transferred, potentially from close contact or contaminated food or water. So this part of that story that always struck me as really interesting was that he was so convinced that he was right that he was like, okay, well, I'll culture this from one of my own patients and drink something that came from their stomach and give myself an ulcer to prove that I'm right. And he was. So anyway, that's how we know that H. pylori tends to cause the majority of gastric ulcers, not spicy foods or stress. All right. This chart, I won't go into too much detail about it. So I'll skip that one for now. It's interesting in all of the things that cause you to produce more or less of various gastric juices, things like saliva or pancreatic juice. But I'll skip that one for now and then move on to one of the things we touched on a minute ago, so the concept of gastric emptying. So in terms of the response of the stomach to filling, so one of the things that the stomach has to be able to do, so I mentioned that the stomach, if it doesn't have anything in it, only holds about 50 milliliters, but when it's full, it can hold up to 4 liters. And so in order to accommodate that much, the stomach has to be able to relax. So there's a couple different types of relaxation. So receptive relaxation is mediated by the brainstem. So as you swallow things, then that causes relaxation of the stomach sort of in anticipation of filling with something, because the brainstem is aware that when you swallow things, then that's going to head to the stomach, and so we gotta make room for it. And so that's sort of that kind of like the feed forward mechanism that we talked about with increasing heart rate or increasing ventilation rate. And then the other one on there is gastric accommodation, and so that's just the intrinsic ability of the smooth muscle to relax in response to being stretched. So once the stomach is stretched a little bit, it sort of has this reflexive further relaxation, and so that allows it then to accommodate more contents. In terms of contractile activity, so the smooth muscle around the stomach actually has its own pacemaker cells, and so then that results in peristaltic waves that help propel food toward that pyloric valve that you see there. And then we talked about the regulation of gastric emptying. So things that, and remember, gastric emptying is the rate at which things move from the stomach to the small intestine. So the way to increase that, to speed things up, moving into the small intestine, is to add more fluid. So if you drink more water, then that results in a more dilute chyme that leaves the stomach faster. Things that decrease gastric emptying or slow the rate at which it leaves the stomach. So if it's really hypertonic, so if that chyme is really concentrated, that could be problematic because remember, if something inside the lumen of the intestine is really, really concentrated, then what that's going to do is draw fluid into the lumen of the intestine. So that could lead to diarrhea. And so we only, if it's particularly concentrated chyme, then we allow even smaller amounts of it into the small intestine at any one time. So really concentrated chyme, really acidic chyme, because just like the esophagus, the small intestine doesn't have that protective layer that the stomach has, and so really acidic contents leaking in or moving into the small intestine can damage the epithelium, the lining of the small intestine. And then the last thing on there, high fat meals. So again, the enzymatic process to break down fat, it just takes a long time, takes longer than it does for things like carbohydrates, and so then that also slows down the rate of gastric emptying. So again, the plus side there though is meals that are higher in fat tend to make you feel full for longer. They tend to produce satiety a little more effectively. All right, so related to the stomach and things leaving it, one of the things I always talk about in class, because I think it's interesting related to the stomach, is the concept of gastric bypass surgery, which is the picture that you see there. So that's bypass. And so what they've done, as you can see in the picture, or what they do, is they remove part of the stomach here, right? And so what they leave you with is this little gastric pouch, which is about the size of a walnut, holds about 1 ounce, so not very much. And so if you have a smaller stomach, you still got the rugae in this little part of it, and you still got the stretch receptors there. And so what that's going to do with that smaller stomach is you're going to feel full much, much faster. And so people are physically unable to consume as much food, plus they feel full really quickly because, again, you can only hold about 1 ounce of fluid. And so with that then tends to produce weight loss because you physically can't consume as much. The other thing with bypass and where the name comes from, so if you bypass something, you go around it. And so what we've done, or what physicians do, so you've got the esophagus here, the gastroesophageal sphincter, this little bit of stomach, the gastric pouch, and then it goes straight into the intestine. And so what we've done is we've actually bypassed the proximal part of the small intestine, the duodenum, and I think part of the jejunum, which is the next section of the intestine as well. And so the rationale for doing that is if you have less small intestine, then you have less places to absorb food. So you're not going to be able to absorb as many calories. And so the combination then of the smaller stomach that physically can't hold as much, and then the less surface area to absorb the nutrients results in less absorption of calories, and so then that tends to result in weight loss. But of course, one of the problems with that is that can result in malabsorption issues. So there are certain things you need to absorb, essential amino acids, which are things that you can't make, and then you've got vitamins and minerals that you need for various metabolic processes. And so by having this bypass, one of the products of that then can be some malabsorption issues. So a more common surgery now is the sleeve. Try and get this to advance. So the gastric sleeve looks like that. And so with the gastric sleeve, what we do, or what is done, is you still got the esophagus, the gastroesophageal sphincter, and then you just have this really small banana-shaped stomach, and then we keep the pyloric sphincter and then the duodenum here as well. And so by doing that, gets us around some of those malabsorption issues. You still have a much smaller stomach. You're still going to feel full sooner. You're still not going to be able to eat as much. So that one tends to be effective at producing weight loss, but not produce those malabsorption issues. And then another one that's done sometimes here in Wisconsin as well is the balloon technique. And so with the balloon technique, what they do is they take this deflated balloon and they put it down inside of the stomach, and then once they get inside of the stomach, what they'll do is to inflate that. And so once that thing is filled to about the size of a grapefruit, then it's going to take up a bunch of space. And so in doing that, again, it's going to make you feel full for longer, or full sooner in this case, and not be able to hold as much in the stomach. And so as you can see there, at times they can insert 2 of those. And the good thing about that surgery is that that one's typically only done for somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 months, and then it's removable. So you haven't actually physically changed any part of your GI tract. The stomach's still the same. The intestines are still the same. You just temporarily reduce the contents that the stomach can hold in that case. All right, so that's it for the first part of the gastrointestinal talk, and so we'll come back to the second part next time. So we'll see you then.